Welcome to the Holmesian voice. Let's get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Illusionist's Gambit, Chapter 1, The Vanishing Trick. I have often noticed that Sherlock Holmes's curiosity seems to have no boundaries. Indeed, he appears to relish the unusual and the extraordinary, anything that stirs his active mind. So, when we received an invitation on a chilly November afternoon to see the famous illusionist Maximilian Frost's debut performance, Holmes accepted with more eagerness than I had expected. At the time, we were both in our sitting room at 221B, Baker Street. I was reading the daily newspaper, and Holmes was fiddling with a scrap of coded text that had arrived by post. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do put that newspaper aside and look at this invitation. Maximilian Frost is said to be the most inventive illusionist on the stage at present. Rumor claims this new show is his greatest achievement. Shall we attend and see if the rumors are true?" He did not really need my agreement, for once his mind was set on something, Holmes acted without hesitation. I glanced at the thick, gold-lettered card. "It announces a November scene display of illusions at the Imperial Theatre," I read aloud. "The debut performance of Maximilian Frost. It might indeed be quite something. Still, I recall the last time you tangled with a self-styled mesmerist, you ended up in a confrontation near Bow Street." Holmes gave a thin smile. "That was an entirely different matter, Watson. This time we can expect a pleasant evening, unless, of course, the illusions leave us with more questions than answers." "That, my dear, would suit me perfectly." Thus our decision was made. That very evening, we took our seats in the Grand Imperial Theatre amidst a sizable crowd of well-dressed Londoners. A lively hum of anticipation filled the air, and Holmes seemed particularly alert, his eyes darting over the stage, the boxes above, and the audience around us. I knew the look. He was mentally cataloguing every detail as he always did. Before long, the orchestra played a short dramatic piece, and the house lights dimmed. Onto the stage stepped a slim, elegant man in a richly colored frock coat. He greeted the audience with a bow so polished that the crowd erupted into immediate applause. This must have been Maximilian Frost. From the very beginning, he showed an ease with each trick that made the illusions feel smooth and seamless. We watched as white doves appeared from nowhere, fluttering about the stage. People gasped, cheered, and laughed with delight. The observer Holmes murmured occasional remarks into my ear. "Notice that mirror backstage, Watson," he whispered at one point. "It sits at just the right angle. I suspect it hides something behind its frame." But even his sharp eyes could not explain every trick. Frost's sleight of hand was so quick that Holmes, though aware some trick was at play, could not see precisely how it was done. The show continued with ever more complicated illusions. Frost transformed silk handkerchiefs into living butterflies and caused a volunteer from the audience to levitate in midair. Another act featured 4 playing cards that rose up, danced about, and vanished in a small burst of smoke. The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause after each feat, clearly delighted this remarkable entertainer. Finally, the stage manager, a stout man named Mr. Hardback, hurried on in a grand voice. He announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for Mr. Frost's crowning illusion, the vanishing trick." A large, finely carved cabinet was wheeled to the center of the stage. Frost, with a dramatic wave of his hand, opened its doors. He invited 2 gentlemen from the front row to step up and confirm that there was nothing inside. After their inspection, the 2 men returned to their seats, satisfied that the cabinet was indeed empty. Then Frost himself stepped into the cabinet. Mr. Hardback closed both doors, carefully turning the cabinet around so everyone could see its solid back. At this point, the audience fell silent, the tension and excitement were palpable. Suddenly, Hardback opened the doors to reveal nothing at all. Maximilian Frost had vanished without a trace. The audience roared its approval, clapping and cheering at the brilliance of the trick. However, the applause soon trailed off into a puzzled hush. People expected Frost to reappear in some clever way, perhaps emerging from a balcony or popping up at the back of the theater, but he did not come back. Mr. Hardback shuffled about on stage, peered into the cabinet once more, and looked towards the wings. The silence grew uncomfortable. A few members of the audience stood up to see if Frost would suddenly reveal himself, yet no one emerged from the shadows. Holmes leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowed in concentration, then as the silence stretched on Hardwick's face, filled with genuine worry, he dashed off and returned with two stagehands who searched behind curtains and props in full view of everyone. Nothing turned up. The gas lights were raised, and the murmurs in the crowd became louder. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Anxious to keep order, Mr. Hardwick cried out, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. This is not part of the show. I fear Mr. Frost has been taken against his will. Please, someone send the police." The word "kidnapped" rippled through the theater, gentlemen looked at one another in concern, and ladies clutched their handbags. Soon, a police constable arrived, pushing his way through the crowd to reach the stage. Holmes and I followed, weaving in and out of panicked spectators until we stood beside the constable and the shaken stage manager. Hardwick seemed close to tears. "I swear it was not part of the ACT, he said. "He should have reappeared in the grand manner he always does, but he's gone, just gone. One moment he was inside the cabinet, then poof, he had vanished entirely." Holmes stepped forward in that calm, focused way I knew so well. He introduced himself by name, and the constable immediately recognized him. "Mr. Holmes," said the officer, relief in his voice, "we certainly need your help with this strange affair. How could a man simply vanish in the middle of a show without any explanation?" Holmes looked thoughtful. "We must tread carefully," he said. "Evidence can disappear as swiftly as Mr. Frost if we are careless. Watson, please be ready with your notes. Let us see if we can find any sign of foul play." I took out my notebook and we followed the holes to the cabinet still standing in the center of the stage. Holmes knelt down, running his long, thin fingers along its edges and tapping gently on the wood. He stopped at one corner, pausing for a moment as though something had caught his interest. Then Holmes got to his feet once more. He turned to Hardback. "You say you noticed nothing unusual as you closed the doors, any odd sound, any movement, or a sudden change in the air?" Hardback shook his head. "No, Mr. Holmes, nothing. I heard a slight rustle as if cloth had brushed against the wood, but that was all." Holmes nodded and studied the cabinet once again, this time stepping around to inspect its back. "We need to question everyone involved," he said quietly, "from yourself to the stagehands and anyone else who might have had access to this area. There is more going on here than a magician's trick gone wrong. Let us leave nothing overlooked." By that, Holmes asked the constable to prevent anyone from tampering with the cabinet until his examination was complete. Meanwhile, I jotted down every detail of the scene, the positions of props, the expressions on people's faces, and the faint footprints left on the dusty stage floor. The audience by now had been asked to exit, but quite a few lingered in the aisles, whispering their theories about what had happened. As Mr. Hardback and the constable tried to maintain order, Holmes beckoned me to one side. His voice was low and measured. "Watson, this was either a disappearance arranged by Mr. Frost himself or something far more sinister. Is perfect vanishes during the biggest trick, leaving everyone uncertain whether it's a performance or a crime. Let us be systematic. We will speak to those closest to Frost, examine the backstage thoroughly, and see if any signs point to a scheme more dangerous than show business." Thus ended the evening's entertainment and began a new mystery. The sudden disappearance of Maximilian Frost was no mere stage illusion, and Holmes appeared eager to uncover the truth. My heart pounded at the thought of what we might discover. Little did I know that what began as a night of dazzling magic would become one of our most puzzling and perilous investigations to date. Chapter 2: The Misdirection in the Wake of Maximilian Frost's Mystifying Disappearance. The Imperial Theatre lay oddly silent. Where there had once been bustling crowds and excited chatter, now only a handful of staff moved about with anxious faces. Sherlock Holmes and I remained at the stage late into the night, examining the stage and its surroundings for any clue that might explain how London's most celebrated illusionist had vanished into thin air. Holmes stood at the edge of the stage with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the spot where Frost had performed his final trick. The curtains, once a rich crimson, seemed dull under the theatre's bare lights. Nearby, the stout stage manager, Mr. Hardback, paced back and forth, wringing his hands. Occasionally, a local constable appeared, guarding the area at Holmes's request. The rest of the audience had been sent home, though a murmur of concern lingered in the air. "There is a distinct sense of misdirection about this case, Watson," Holmes remarked quietly as he stepped from the stage onto the backstage area. "A vanishing act is by nature designed to fool the eye, yet the panic that followed suggests something more than stagecraft. Whether Mr. Frost orchestrated his own disappearance or someone else orchestrated it for him remains to be seen." I followed him through a narrow passage behind the scenery. Flats on the wooden floor creaked beneath us, and we brushed past coils of rope and half-painted backdrops. We soon found Mr. Hardback, who was halted by the large cabinet Frost had used for his final illusion. The cabinet doors stood ajar, revealing only empty space within. "Mr. Holmes," Hardback said, sounding almost out of breath, "I don't know what else to tell you. One minute Mr. Frost was in there, and the next he was gone. I've never seen anything like it." Holmes placed a calming hand on Hardback's shoulder. "Think carefully about any unusual sounds, sensations, or unexpected figures lurking about." Hardback shook his head. "Only that faint rustling from inside the cabinet just before I opened the doors. I can't explain it. I truly believe he's been kidnapped. Mr. Frost would never abandon a performance at its climax. The man lived for applause." Holmes nodded solemnly. "We'll need to speak with everyone who worked here tonight, stagehands, actors, anyone who might have seen or heard something of use." We began by interviewing the stagehands who had assisted Frost. Several confirmed that the illusionist was secretive regarding his methods. One admitted in hushed tones to having witnessed Frost receive late-night deliveries of odd parcels. Another mentioned overhearing heated discussions behind closed doors. Though he could not identify the other party involved from these scattered remarks, Holmes formed an early theory that Frost's personal affairs might be more complicated than his public persona suggested. As we gathered details, Holmes's discerning gaze took in each corner of the backstage area. Suddenly, he crouched by a tall cracked mirror propped against a wall, its surface reflecting distorted images of stray props. Tiny splinters of glass lay scattered on the floor. Watson said, "Look here. A broken mirror is not unusual in a theater, but notice how the glass has been fractured. The diagonal crack indicates considerable force. This didn't happen weeks ago, and the edges of the break are fresh." I knelt beside him, carefully avoiding the shards. "Could have occurred during the performance accident." Holmes ran his fingertips along the jagged edge. "Possibly, but there's something else." He leaned in and inhaled. "Slight chloroform." A faint trace lingered on the wooden frame. "That's very telling, Watson. Chloroform was not standard in any theatrical production I knew of, even one as elaborate as Frost's illusions." Holmes surmised that someone might have used it to subdue Frost or any other person interfering with their plot. The broken mirror suggested a hurried or forceful confrontation, leaving behind evidence of foul play. We had little time to process this discovery before a soft voice spoke from behind us. Turning, we saw Miss Lily Montague, the theater's leading lady, standing nervously near the velvet drapes. She was clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her eyes glistening with worry. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said, her voice trembling, "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I might have information that could help." Holmes rose, offering a polite bow. "We are always glad of any insight." Miss Montague stepped forward and lowered her voice. "I know that Mr. Frost and I had our disagreements. He was very protective of his stage time, often pushing the rest of us aside, but lately, he seemed consumed by fear. I once overheard him speaking with a visitor, a man with a strong accent. I didn't recognize him. Their conversation was tense. I caught Mr. Frost saying, 'I won't be threatened, not after all I've risked.' Then the visitor left, slamming the dressing room door behind him." Miss Montague swallowed hard. "I never learned who that man was, but he seemed dangerous." After that incident, Mr. Frost became more distant. "If you ask me, this disappearance has roots far beyond the theater." Holmes regarded her intently. "Thank you, Miss Montague. Did you ever see this man's face or hear his name mentioned?" She shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not, but I know Frost was receiving odd packages, sometimes under another name. He told me once they were just stage props from abroad, but he looked so nervous saying it. I suspected otherwise." With that, she bowed slightly and withdrew, leaving Holmes and me to exchange concerned glances. The evidence of clandestine dealings grew thicker with each new revelation. Indeed, the man described sounded like someone with a strong motive to force Frost's disappearance. We continued our tour of the backstage area, speaking with more of the theater's employees. Echoed Miss Mon's comments. Frost had recently grown anxious conducting secret business and frequently sneaking away after rehearsals. Some whispered dark rumors of smuggling or gambling debts, but no one could produce solid proof. Finally, we returned to the stage where the unassuming cabinet still stood like a silent accomplice in the unfolding mystery. Holmes ran a hand along its polished edge, pausing at a faint scratch near the base. "It could be a mere scuff," he said quietly, "or it could mean that this apparatus was shifted under haste or duress. Everything points to a plan set in motion behind the curtain of normal theater life." Mr. Hardback, who had been hovering nearby, gave a despairing sigh. The newspapers had already begun asking questions. He confessed that if the world believed Frost was involved in crime or if he remained missing, our theater would suffer, perhaps beyond repair. Holmes turned to him. "I understand your concern, Mr. Hardback, but let us not jump to conclusions about Mr. Frost's guilt. For now, we know only that he had secrets and that someone either took advantage of his grand finale to abduct him or aided him in a hidden scheme. No matter which is true, we must uncover the facts before rumors destroy both his reputation and the theater's." Hardback nodded miserably, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Is there anything I can do, Mr. Holmes?" Provided the names of everyone who had access to the backstage area tonight, Holmes replied, along with a record of any deliveries Frost had received in the last few weeks. "Also, make discreet inquiries among the theater staff about unusual sightings or overheard conversations, have them speak only to me or the constable." With that, we stepped out onto the dimly lit stage. Holmes turned in a slow circle, absorbing every detail. By the time we left the theater, the gas lamps outside had burned low, and a thin mist crept along the London streets. As we walked back toward Baker Street, I could feel the weight of the mystery pressing upon us. Holmes struck a thoughtful pose, his coat collar turned up against the chill. The events of the night had revealed only the glimpse of a larger puzzle. We had broken mirrors, the scent of chloroform, ominous warnings from Miss Montague, and signs that Frost himself might have seen danger. When Holmes finally spoke, his voice was measured. Watson. We stood at the border between illusion and reality. Frost's disappearance could have been a cunning self-devised trick or a genuine abduction by ruthless individuals. One fact is certain, the key lies in unraveling the secrets he kept off stage, and so exhausted but resolute, we headed into the silent London dawn determined to pursue every clue left in the trail of Maximilian Frost's vanishing act. There was no telling what further revelations awaited us, only that we would continue until the puzzle was solved or the illusions overtake us entirely in Chapter 3 of The Locked Room. Early the following morning, Sherlock Holmes and I made our way back to the Imperial Theatre, determined to examine Maximilian Frost's private domain in the cold light of day. The events of the previous night still weighed heavily on my mind. The broken mirror, the lingering, the scent of chloroform and the troubling hints that Frost's vanishing act was tied to a far darker scheme, of course, remained calm as ever, though I could tell he was keen to see what secrets the dressing room might yield once he had enough time and daylight to investigate. Upon our arrival, Mr. Hardback greeted us with red-rimmed eyes. He had scarcely slept, fretting that the theatre's reputation might be ruined if news spread too widely. I'll take you straight to Mr. Frost's dressing room, he told Holmes, fiddling with a ring of keys. The police have kept it locked since you asked them to. I'm afraid no one has been inside since last night. That is precisely what I wished for, Holmes said, giving a curt nod. We must see it in its undisturbed state. Lead the way. We followed Hardback down a narrow backstage corridor until we reached a plain wooden door with a nameplate that read M. Frost. The corridors were quiet at this hour, with only a few stagehands about, moving scenery and sweeping floors. Hardback unlocked the door and stepped aside. Holmes entered first, and I closely followed. At first glance, the dressing room did not appear unusual. A large mirror dominated one side, framed by little light bulbs. A costume rack stood near the opposite wall, draped with lavish cloaks and suits in deep purples and blues. A dressing table sat in the middle, its surface crowded with makeup containers, brushes, and a few cryptic notes scribbled on scraps of paper. The faint smell of grease paint lingered in the air, giving the room that familiar theatrical scent. Holmes's eyes roamed quickly over the scene. Nothing here suggests a violent act. Struggle, he remarked in a low voice. The table was neatly arranged, the costume rack looked undisturbed, yet I added there were footprints in the dust near the far side. It seemed like someone was standing over that small chest. After a while, Holmes approached the chest in question, a stout wooden box tucked beneath the hanging costumes. He crouched, lifting its lid. Inside was a jumble of stage props, silk scarves, collapsible rods, and a few colorful boxes used for illusions. He rummaged about with care, checking the corners for hidden compartments at length. He placed the items back, closed the lid, and shook his head. Not here, he muttered. Let us see what the dressing table conceals. He proceeded to examine the table's drawers, sliding each open with smooth efficiency. Most contained ordinary personal effects, pocket combs, half-used containers of grease paint, and extra cuff links. I watched Hardwick hover anxiously at the threshold, as though he was worried Holmes might overturn the entire place. After all, it was a theater. Everything had its place, and any disturbance could bring chaos on performance nights. To Hardwick's visible relief, Holmes replaced each drawer carefully, but then he paused. He tapped the underside of the middle drawer with his knuckles, frowning as if something about the sound displeased him. Pulling the drawer fully out, he turned it upside down to inspect the base. There's a second layer here, Watson said, running his fingertips along the bottom. Yes, a false bottom, quite neatly fitted. In a single swift motion, Holmes slid the hidden panel aside, revealing a slim leather-bound notebook tucked within. It had no title, only a delicate clasp. I glanced at Hardback, who looked utterly astounded. Holmes opened it to the first page. Instead of normal writing, we saw a series of jumbled letters and symbols, a cipher. Holmes announced, scanning the entries, this appeared to be some form of ledger. Each entry had a date and a coded note next to it, and here he ran a finger down the column with repeated references to the final act. Could that be the illusion Frost was preparing or something more clandestine? Hardback looked pale. I had no idea Mr. Frost never let anyone near his personal writings. Are you certain it's a ledger? Holmes nodded. Nearly so. Certain letters repeat in patterns consistent with transactions or lists of names. We shall decode it in time. For now, we must accept that whatever final act he had planned may involve large sums of money. Look, there are notations beside some entries, sums that appear in the margin. They may indicate payments or debts owed to hidden associates. As Holmes continued leafing through the ciphered ledger, I decided to check the dressing table's lower compartments. Opening the cupboard door beneath, I discovered a small cloth bundle wedged behind the spare makeup boxes. Carefully, I lifted it out. It was a handkerchief, once white but now stained a deep ruddy brown. My heart sank at the sight of holes. I called out softly, "There's blood on this." Holmes looked up, his expression grim. He placed the ledger down and bent over the handkerchief. Indeed, it's not fresh, but it isn't fully dried. This is recent, a sign that Mr. Frost or someone in close proximity was injured. Hardback let out a shaky breath. So he was hurt or worse. Holmes examined the cloth more closely, noting the embroidered initials in one corner, MFA. It's undoubtedly his, he said. This confirms that Frost's life may be in grave danger and that if he was abducted, his captors might not have handled him gently. Shaken by the discovery, we placed the bloody handkerchief aside, preserving it as evidence. Holmes turned back to the ledger, flipping to the final pages. More references to this final act and dates that coincide with upcoming shipments or deliveries. These might be code for meetings or payoffs. I saw repeated mentions of a symbol that looks like a circle. It reappears next to certain sums. The circle. I ventured to recall. The whispers. We had heard of secret dealings and dangerous associates. It was the first time I had spoken the name aloud. Holmes gave a curt nod. Indeed, if that name matches what we have learned, then Mr. Frost was involved with a group operating beyond mere stage illusions. Perhaps that was the debt Montague spoke of. Mr. Hardback, looking thoroughly alarmed, asked what this meant for Mr. Frost. That he was playing in a perilous dilemma, Holmes replied, closing the ledger. And his so-called final act might have been his attempt to escape it. Whether he planned to vanish of his own accord or was forced by a rival, one thing is clear: we must decipher this ledger and find him before it's too late. Without another word, we secured the coded notebook. The somber mood in that small dressing room pressed in on us, heavier than the velvet curtains on the stage. Though we knew more now than before about hidden ledgers, coded dealings, and violent signs of a struggle, we were left with as many questions as answers. In truth, we had entered the dressing room hoping for a clue as to Maximilian Frost's whereabouts. Instead, we emerged with grim confirmation that his life hung in the balance as Holmes locked the door behind us. I felt a chill. The illusions we had witnessed from Frost were mere tricks compared to the real mystery unfolding before us. In Chapter 4, The Secret Rival, news of Maximilian Frost's disappearance spread quickly through London's theatrical circles, fueling whispers of both foul play and cunning trickery. Sherlock Holmes, never one to shy away from the unusual, lost no time in pursuing every stray lead. One such lead involved a lesser-known illusionist named Elias Martin, who was seen near the Imperial Theatre on the night Frost vanished. Word reached Holmes through a watchful stagehand who recognized Martin by his unmistakable top hat and flamboyant. I recall he was hanging in the alley. The stagehand told us to watch the back entrance as if waiting for someone. Then, as soon as the commotion started inside, he disappeared. Armed with this information, Holmes resolved to seek out Martin. At once, we found the man in a modest studio on the fringes of the Covent Garden, a cramped space that smelled faintly of sawdust and lamp oil. A broken sign reading Ian's Magical Curiosities hung above a narrow doorway. Inside, I noticed a row of half-finished illusions, mechanical boxes with mirrored panels and painted backdrops depicting strange things. Elias Martin himself was a wiry fellow with sharp features and restless eyes. He wore a slightly battered frock coat with its edges frayed, giving the impression of a man struggling to keep up appearances. When he saw Holmes and me, he started, nearly dropping a bundle of brightly colored scarves. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," Maroon said wearily, "to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Without wasting time, Holmes introduced us and broached the subject of Maximilian Frost. At the mention of Frost's name, Maroon's lips curled in a bitter smile. "So you've come to blame me for his disappearance, have you? The entire city assumes I must be behind it simply because I've stood in Frost's shadow all these years." Holmes spoke calmly, his gaze unwavering. "We came not with accusations but with questions. You were observed near the Imperial Theatre on the night Frost vanished." Maroon turned away, fiddling with the levers on a half-built mechanical contraption. "Yes, I was there," he admitted, "but I had nothing to do with Frost's vanishing act, at least not in the criminal sense." "Explain," Holmes prompted. "I heard rumors that Frost was planning an extravagant new illusion, one that would outshine every trick on the London stage. Call it professional rivalry. I went to see if I could learn anything. I watched from the shadows, hoping to glean some insight, but before I could slip inside, there was an uproar, people shouting that Frost had disappeared for real. Not just as part of the show. I panicked and fled, not wanting to be linked to whatever trouble he'd stirred up." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "So you admit the rivalry was enough to push you to harm him?" Maroon faced us again, and for an instant, I glimpsed genuine hurt in his expression. Yes, I was envious of Frost's fame. He drew every marquee in every newspaper while I struggled to fill half the seats he did, but I never wished him any real harm. If anything, I wanted to prove my illusions could rival his. Honestly, I'd have nothing to gain by making him vanish in a way I couldn't flaunt." Holmes regarded him for a moment. "Did you hear or see anything else that might suggest Frost was in danger?" Martin let out a low sigh. "Frost was involved in matters far beyond the stage, though the details eluded me. I have heard rumors, murmurs in the underbelly of that world, about smuggling, debts, and dealing with unsavory people. They say he had a knack for making more than coins appear out of thin air. If you follow my meaning of this revelation." Holmes pressed for specifics, but Martin could provide little else. Beyond gossip, the notion that Frost had entangled himself in a web of illicit dealings supported much of what we had begun to suspect. By the time we left, Holmes appeared neither fully convinced of the Maroon's innocence nor inclined to believe him guilty. He could be telling the truth, Holmes observed to me as we stepped out into the dim, bustling street, yet that does not exclude the possibility that he knows more than he admits. We had barely returned to Baker Street when a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson showed a breathless young man, a messenger with wild eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I come from Elias Mast's studio." "There's been a breaking." Holmes leapt to his feet. In short order, we were in a hansom cab rattling back to Maroon's workshop. The moment we arrived, we saw splintered wood around the door frame of one of the windows had been smashed, scattering glass across the pavement. Outside, the scene was one of chaos. Illusions overturned, papers strewn, and the pungent smell of some chemical or powder in the air. Martin stood in the center of the mess, shaking her head in disbelief. "I left only an hour ago," Marin stammered. "Nothing was a mistake." "Then someone's ransacked the place." Holmes glided through the wreckage, picking up scattered pieces of apparatus and examining them closely. He paused at a battered trunk in the corner, its lock pried open. Glancing inside, he found a nest of shredded documents and fragments of wood that might once have formed part of a trick cabinet. "Were these plans for a new illusion?" Holmes asked. The master nodded glumly. "Yes, I was working on something I hoped would rival Frost's best show, but whoever did this hardly seemed interested in my illusions. They rifled through everything as though searching for something special." Holmes ran a hand along the trunk. "Jagged splinters, evidently. Did you keep any records here? Letters, contracts, anything that might be valuable or incriminating?" "There was nothing of that sort," Martin replied, voice edged with frustration. "I only had a few personal notes and designs. It's all worthless to anyone else." Holmes crouched to inspect a faint footprint on the dust-strewn floor. The impression suggested a heavy boot. Another partial print indicated more than one intruder. Despite the workshop's disarray, they had left no obvious clue as to their identity. After a thorough survey, Holmes straightened, grave expression. "Someone believes you know more than you claim, or that you possess something they desperately want. Either way, your life and livelihood may be in danger." Mr. Marin opened and closed his hands in agitation, "But I only tell you the truth. I had no direct hand in Frost's disappearance. Who else would think otherwise?" "That," Holmes said quietly, "is what I intend to find out. This break-in was no random burglary. It's aimed at securing a hidden piece of the puzzle." We left Marin's workshop more puzzled than ever. Another strand in the tangled mystery had revealed itself. It seemed feared that Marin might hold information relevant to Frost's fate. As the evening shadows lengthened over the grimy London streets, I couldn't help wondering if Maximilian Frost's final act had indeed drawn in more players than any of us knew. Holmes, for his part, wore a forced expression as he hailed a cab. "Come, Watson," he said, "we must examine every thread of this tapestry. If Elias Marin is as innocent as he claims, then we must discover who would risk so much to silence him and how that peril ties back to the missing illusionist." Chapter 5 of the Sinister Society. A grey drizzle swept across London the morning Sherlock Holmes decided to unravel the contents of the mysterious ledger found in Maximilian Frost's dressing room. We had already seen references to payment ciphers and repeated mentions of what appeared to be a circle-like symbol. Now seated at the table in our sitting room at 221B, Baker Street, Holmes bent intently over the pages, eyes flicking between lines of cryptic script. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill lingering in the damp air. "I believe I have it, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice holding that rare note of triumph which signaled a mental breakthrough. "This ledger points to a group calling itself the Circle, operating beneath the veneer of respectable society, noticing how the sum totals correspond to shipping destinations along the Thames. Paired with these symbols, it strongly implies smuggling. If Frost's name is here, then he was deeply involved." I leaned in to inspect the page he indicated. Under the coded entries, a faint pattern emerged: dates, destination, amounts. It was as though each entry mapped a route across London's river docks, connecting shipments of dubious cargo next to some figures. Frost's name appeared in neat script, confirming he was no innocent bystander. Holmes closed the ledger gently. "It seems the Circle disguises itself as a gentleman's club, complete with elegant premises and membership rosters. Through legitimate gatherings, they cloak illicit deals. Frost's final illusions may have been more than theatrical feats. He could have been ferrying contraband in plain sight, slipping illegal goods backstage, then out again under cover of performance. Eager to test this theory, Holmes decided our next step was to visit the supposed haunt of the Circle, a discreet establishment occupying a tall, discreet townhouse in a respectable quarter near Pall Mall. Word had reached him through a series of well-placed inquiries that certain well-heeled gentlemen frequented this place at odd hours. They were rumored to conduct closed-door meetings admit only those with the proper introductions. By mid-afternoon, Holmes had transformed himself into an older gentleman of distinguished appearance. He wore a tailored suit and carried a silver-topped cane that lent him an air of quiet authority. I accompanied him as a valet of sorts charged with assisting his every whim. We arrived on a hired road, stepping down onto the slick pavement outside the unremarkable townhouse. A brass plate, well polished but without inscription, adorned the door. Holmes knocked, and a butler in immaculate livery answered. At first, his face showed no reaction, but Holmes extended a small embossed card and murmured a phrase I could not quite catch. The butler's expression shifted ever so slightly, and he bowed, allowing us entrance inside. The hallway was carpeted with thick rugs, the walls lined with portraits of stern-faced men in 18th-century dress. Soft voices drifted from a drawing room at the far end. Candle sconces cast a subdued glow, adding to the atmosphere of hushed exclusivity. Following Holmes's silent lead, I trailed him through the hall until we entered a spacious parlor. There were several gentlemen sipping brandy and smoking cigars. At our arrival, their conversation dwindled. Holmes offered them a courteous bow and introduced himself with a false name. He spoke of business ventures and excellent opportunities for discreet trade, phrases that piqued their interest. The men nodded, some with knowing glances. I took up a discreet position by the door, eyes scanning the room. A polished side table held crystal decanters and silver trays. On one tray lay a few folded letters, each sealed with a wax imprint of a circular design, unmistakably the same symbol from the ledger. My pulse quickened. This, without doubt, was the Circle's inner sanctum or at least one of its meeting places. Holmes engaged the men in polite small talk, alluding to foreign shipments that might slip unnoticed through London's port. Gradually, they warned him, dropping hints of deals and alliances. One gentleman, a tall figure with hawkish features, remarked, "Our associates hold high standards, a pity that Mr. Frost fell short of them, careless of risking our entire operation for the sake of theatrical flair." Holmes took a slow sip of brandy to mask his reaction. "Indeed, I've heard rumors he vanished unexpectedly." A wry laugh passed through the group. "Vanished?" "Yes," said another man, swirling his glass. "He believed he could take certain items for himself and slip away, but no one double-crosses the Circle without consequences." Those words hung heavily in the air. My heart thumped at the confirmation that Frost's predicament involved more than routine smuggling. He had tried to break free or betray them and now found himself paying the price. Holmes remained composed. "Unfortunate," he murmured, "but then not everyone understands the necessity of loyalty in such matters." More nods and low chuckles ensued. Sensing he had gleaned enough without arousing suspicion, Holmes made polite farewells. We departed the townhouse moments later, stepping into the fading light. Once the door shut behind us, Holmes lengthened his stride, quietly signaling me to follow suit once inside. The waiting room, he removed the false mustache and exhaled. "We have confirmed the Circle's involvement in Frost's fate. He was evidently attempting to outwit them, steal something of great value perhaps, and was preparing his grand disappearance to cover his tracks, yet they caught wind of it. Then Frost may still be alive," I said, hopeful despite the dire circumstances. "They may have seized him to reclaim whatever he took," Holmes nodded gravely. "The men in that parlor spoke as if Frost's punishment was inevitable, but they did not mention his death." We must act swiftly. If we can discover exactly what Frost stole, we may find leverage to free him or at least trace his captors. He opened the ledger once more, his keen eyes racing over the coded entries. We know these shipments pass through various dockside warehouses. Tomorrow we shall investigate the docks. Somewhere there lies the key to this entire affair. If we can find evidence that ties Frost to a specific item coveted by the Circle, we might learn where they are holding him. As the room moved away from that nondescript townhouse, I felt a surge of determination. Maximilian Frost's illusions had dazzled London, yet it was his real-life gamble with smugglers and secret societies that now threatened to end his career and his life in the most chilling way. Despite the fog and the rain, Holmes seemed quietly confident. The path was fraught with danger, but we had at least uncovered the hidden puppet masters behind Frost's disappearance, and that knowledge gave us a chance, however slim, of rescuing the wayward illusionist before time ran out. Chapter 6: The Trail of Smoke. A cold, gray dawn greeted us as Sherlock Holmes and I set out from Baker Street in search of answers among the city's dockside warehouses. Our mission was to follow the faintest clues from Maximilian Frost's coded ledger, which pointed to a particular wharf where secretive shipments tied to the Circle were said to arrive. Despite the early hour, the docks were already stirring with the daily business of loading and unloading cargo. Longshoremen bustled about, their breath visible in the chill air while gulls circled overhead on rocks. We soon found ourselves among a maze of warehouses and stacked crates, each section identified by painted numbers. Holmes paused by a faded sign reading Barrett and Company Imports, running his fingers thoughtfully over the peeling paint. Observing Watson, he said quietly, "This name appears in Frost's ledger, besides several cryptic shipments. It may be the key to unraveling his role in the Circle's smuggling scheme." One by one, we examined the large doors lining the warehouse road, seeking any sign of unusual cargo. Eventually, Holmes stopped at a heavy padlock securing a side entrance to a building seemingly out of use. Rather than attempt to pick the lock openly, he circled around to a battered wooden door at the rear, which yielded with surprising ease under gentle pressure. Inside the warehouse, it was dim and musty. Daylight leaked through high windows, illuminating dust motes in the still air. An acrid smell reminiscent of chemicals tingled the nose. Holmes held a finger to his lips and beckoned me to follow as he crept past the precarious towers of crates and barrels. We heard voices, gruff, low murmurs from somewhere deeper in the gloom. We advanced carefully, mindful of each footstep, until we came upon a small makeshift office formed by wooden partitions. A dull glow seeped through a gap, revealing two men poring over a ledger. Holmes motioned for me to stay back while he inched closer, no doubt hoping to hear their conversation. My friend's face grew intense as he leaned in, straining to catch the whispered words of who had arrived last night. One man muttered, tapping the ledger with a thick finger, "We'll rebrand them, then ship them out again under a different name, same procedure as always. Just mind the Circle schedule." The second man, a wiry fellow in a long coat, replied, "If you ask me, we've got bigger worries. Word is Frost tried to cheat him, took something irreplaceable, some antique artifact or so the rumors say. Now they want his head. We're meant to keep an eye out. If he shows up, we bring him in alive, at least for a while." Holmes and I exchanged alarmed glances. This confirmed that Frost was marked for death or, at best, a grim interrogation. For a moment, Holmes seemed poised to linger and gather more intel, but fate intervened. My foot dislodged a small shard of wood, which clattered against a barrel. The noise, though slight, proved enough to raise the men's suspicions instantly. Both men froze. Then one rushed out of the makeshift office, pistol drawn, shouting, "Who's there?" Holmes seized my arm, and we ducked behind a nearby crate. My heart hammered as footsteps thundered across the concrete floor. We tried to move away quietly, but a stack of crates tumbled behind us, crashing in a dreadful cacophony of shouts that rang out once more. Figures emerged from the shadows, armed with crude clubs. We found ourselves cornered in the dim aisle. The group of men was advancing with dangerous intent. "Holmes," I hissed, preparing to defend myself with nothing more than my walking stick. "We're rather outnumbered." He offered a tight nod, eyes glinting with determination. "We must make our escape," he murmured. "Stick close to me, Watson." The men lunged with swift, brutal force. One swung a club at my head, but I managed to parry with my stick. Meanwhile, Holmes deftly sidestepped another as the sleuth delivered a precise blow that sent the man staggering. A second adversary grabbed Holmes from behind, but he twisted free, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's midsection. Amid the melee, crates toppled and dust billowed through the air. The sharp crack of a pistol sounded from somewhere behind us, and I felt a bullet whiz past my shoulder. Heart pounding, I lashed out with my stick again, forcing one attacker to retreat. Holmes lunged forward, seized a half-loose board from a crate, and drove our pursuers back. For a moment, we saw our chance. "This way!" Holmes shouted, nodding toward a narrow passage between towering piles of boxes. We scrambled through, the men's shouts echoing behind us. We weaved in and out until we found a narrow side door. Together, we shoved it open and burst out onto the docks. Fresh air flooding our lungs. A thick fog hovered over the Thames, obscuring our shapes as we fled. We hurried along the water's edge, seeking cover behind a row of stacked barrels until the shouts from the warehouse grew distant. Finally, when we were certain no one followed, we slipped onto a nearby street. There we paused to catch our breath, my heart thudding and Holmes's face pale but resolute. We learned that Frost had stolen something priceless. Holmes said in a low voice, the Circle was determined to claim it and punish him for his betrayal. Thanks to that fracas, we lack the exact nature of the artifact, but we know enough that Frost's enemies view him as a grave threat. I leaned heavily against a lamppost, wiping sweat from my brow. "Are you hurt, Holmes?" He shook his head. "A few bruises, nothing more. We've escaped with our lives and vital information." Those men confirmed that Frost was still alive, or at least he was the last time they spoke. The Circle wanted to retrieve both him and the artifact. In the distance, a tugboat on the Thames let out a mournful whistle, and the faint haze of morning gave way to a dull light. The city never paused, never slept, especially not down at the docks. People milled about, indifferent to our plight. "We should return to Baker Street," Holmes continued calmly. "Once we collected ourselves, we had to plan our next move carefully. We knew Frost was cunning enough to steal from the Circle. If we could discover exactly what he had taken, perhaps we could leverage that knowledge to track him down before the Circle delivered its final blow." So we hailed a hansom cab and departed the swirling fog of the waterfront. Hearts still hammering from the close call. Our brief foray among the warehouses had taught us one thing above all: Maximilian Frost was no helpless victim. He was a man entangled in a dangerous game, and though he had tried to outfox his criminal allies, he had underestimated the ruthlessness that lurked behind the curtains of London's underworld, yet in that lesson lay the glimmer of a solution and a renewed determination to find him alive. Chapter 7, Shadows Foretold. Back at 221B, Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat hunched over the small desk by the window, surrounded by a forest of loose papers. Sunlight filtered weakly through a break in the clouds, illuminating the coded ledger and several scribbled sheets of notes. I stood by, observing as he worked, pen in hand, a focused crease in his brow. We had brought back bruises and tension from our scuffle at the docks, but Holmes, with typical resilience, insisted on tackling Maximilian Frost's cipher at once. convinced it held the key to the illusionist's fate. The events of recent days weighed heavily upon us both. We now knew that Frost had crossed a secretive group called the Circle and that he had stolen something so valuable they would stop at nothing to reclaim it. We also knew his disappearance had not been the mere mishap it first seemed. The smuggling network's hired thugs had confirmed Frost was marked for punishment. Even so, Holmes believed there was more to the story, something hidden in the coded ledger's final pages. For hours, he pored over the cryptic lines, every so often murmuring in satisfaction or striking out a frustrated scribble. At last, he laid down his pencil with a triumphant tap. "Watson," he said, voice low yet urgent, "it's precisely as I suspected. These final entries are instructions for Frost's personal grand finale. But it isn't merely an illusion for the stage. Look. Here are dates, times, references to shipping routes, and false identities. Frost was planning to fake his own disappearance entirely." I leaned in and scanned the deciphered text. Each line referred to a specific time or location, followed by an alias or coded phrase that seemed to represent prepared steps of an elaborate scheme. He intended to vanish from public life under the very guise of his biggest illusion, then slip out of London. Quite possibly, he meant to change his name and begin again. These notes show payments to forgers, passage on a merchant vessel bound for distant shores, and even the adoption of a different hair color to avoid recognition. It was a bold plan, typical of a man who had based his livelihood on deception. "So the final trick was never just about impressing a theater audience," I said quietly. "He wanted to disappear from the Circle's clutches precisely," Holmes replied. "A conjurer's greatest performance, vanish in plain sight and leave behind no trace." He tapped the page again. "The trouble is, he didn't vanish by choice. On that stage, someone got wind of his intentions. Instead of orchestrating his own well-timed exit, Frost became a victim of a far more sinister disappearance, one arranged by the Circle." A knot formed in my stomach as I realized the implications. Then he's out of time. Whatever the Circle wants from him, they'll be merciless in extracting it. Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Indeed. Now consider these lines here. Frost mentions a final debt, an item so irreplaceable that losing it would bring swift retaliation. We heard talk at the warehouse that he stole an artifact. If that item is truly critical to the Circle smuggling operation, then Frost is likely alive, but only so long as they believe they can force him to return it or reveal its location." My friend's gaze shifted to a small map spread out on the desk. Docks, warehouses, and certain addresses near the Thames were marked in pencil. One particular address, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of Wapping, had been underlined 3 times. This warehouse appeared to be where Frost planned to stage the final step of his ruse. Holmes continued, he was to retrieve the artifact, whatever it may be, from the Circle shipments, then deal with a Confederate who would sneak him aboard a departing vessel. "Do you think," I asked, "that is also where the Circle might be holding him?" Holmes tapped his chin. "It's a possibility. Frost's plan was meticulously timed, so the Circle would have needed only to intercept him at that crucial juncture. If they had discovered his scheme in advance, they might have arranged an ambush. The location, after all, was remote enough for them to carry out a kidnapping without drawing notice." Before I could press further, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a small tray. "Just a D for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her usual gentle demeanor tinged with concern. She must have sensed the tension filling our lodgings these last few days. Holmes thanked her and tore open the telegram. His expression darkened as he read. "Watson," he said, holding it out, "this may confirm our suspicions." The telegram, unsigned, consisted of a single cryptic sentence: "Frost's final act is undone. The Circle watches every move we make." To the Circle smuggling operation, then Frost is likely alive, but only so long as they believe they can force him to return it or reveal its location. My friend's gaze shifted to a small map spread out on the desk. Docks, warehouses, and certain addresses near the Thames were marked in pencil. One particular address, a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of Wapping, had been underlined 3 times. This warehouse appeared to be where Frost planned to stage the final step of his ruse. Holmes continued. He was to retrieve the artifact, whatever it may be, from the Circle shipments, then deal with a Confederate who would sneak him aboard a departing vessel. Do you think, I asked, that is also where the Circle might be holding him? Holmes tapped his chin. It's a possibility. Frost's plan was meticulously timed, so the Circle would have needed only to intercept him at that crucial juncture. If they discovered his scheme in advance, they might have arranged an ambush. The location, after all, was remote enough for them to carry out a kidnapping without drawing notice. Before I could press further, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a small tray. "Just a D for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her usual gentle demeanor tinged with concern. She must have sensed the tension filling our lodgings these last few days. Holmes thanked her and tore open the telegram. His expression darkened as he read. "Watson," he said, holding it out, "this may confirm our suspicions." The telegram, unsigned, consisted of a single cryptic sentence: "Frost's final act is undone. The Circle watches every move." We exchanged. Street was resigned to confronting the dark shadows that now held the Illusionist in their grasp in Chapter 8, a convergence unseen as the U.S. crept over London. The gas lamps outside the Imperial Theatre began to glow, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Sherlock Holmes and I arrived at the scene of Maximilian Frost's fateful performance, drawn by the final pieces of evidence suggesting that our missing illusionist might be hidden within the very place he had dazzled audiences. The swirling rumors, the coded ledger, and the dire telegram all pointed to one conclusion: the theater's own staff might be at the center of this perilous game. Mr. Hardback, the theater's stage manager, greeted us with visible apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, "I had no idea you meant to return tonight. Everything has been in a dreadful state since Mr. Frost vanished." Holmes offered a polite bow and a mild smile. "And yet, Mr. Hardback, you were so gracious as to leave the stage free, just as I requested in my note." His tone was clipped and formal, hinting at some hidden plan. We stepped into the grand auditorium, where scattered props and half-dismantled sets bore witness to the abrupt end of Frost's show. Holmes scanned the dimly lit aisles, then climbed onto the stage with purposeful strides. I followed him, noticing that Hardback lingered in the wings, his posture tense. "Forgive my curiosity," Hardback called uncertainly. "Might I ask what you plan to do?" Holmes's gray eyes shone with determination. "I intend," he said, "to stage a disappearing act of my own, one that will flush out those responsible for Mr. Frost's predicament." With an enigmatic gesture, he beckoned the few stagehands present to gather near. He spoke quickly but clearly, instructing them in the arrangement of certain curtains and lights, specifying exactly which trapdoors to unlock. Though puzzled, they obeyed his directions without question. Meanwhile, I could not help noticing that Hardback seemed increasingly uneasy. The man's face glistened with perspiration, and his gaze darted anxiously about the theater. Something in his demeanor reminded me of a cornered fox, yet I held my peace, trusting that Holmes was laying a trap, one that would soon be sprung upon the correct target. At length, Holmes turned to the backstage area. "Hardback," he called, "would you be so good as to prepare the cabinet for Mr. Frost's final act? We require it for tonight's demonstration." Hardback gave a reluctant nod, summoning 2 stagehands to wheel the iconic cabinet onto the stage. The polished wood gleamed under the footlights. Only a few days earlier, it had been the setting for Frost's startling disappearance. Now it stood once more, quiet and mysterious. Once everything was in place, Holmes paced to the center of the stage and addressed the dimly lit auditorium as though an audience were present. "Ladies and gentlemen," he proclaimed, "tonight we conclude the most challenging case by recreating the conditions of Mr. Frost's vanishing trick. We intend to shed light on the master illusion behind it all." He signaled the stagehands to douse the primary lights, leaving a single spotlight. With a slight bow to me, Holmes stepped into the cabinet. Hardback. Swallowing visibly, moved to shut its doors, my heart pounded in the hush, half expecting some dire interruption. Then, with a flourish, Hardback flung the doors wide. As with Frost before him, Holmes was gone. A moment of tense silence stretched. Suddenly, a thump echoed from the wings of the theater. Lights flickered. Half lost in the gloom, I saw a tall silhouette slip onto the stage, heading straight for the cabinet. Another figure crept after him, pistol raised. In a burst of movement, the second person seized the first by the arm and let out a startled cry. At once, the footlights blazed to life. Holmes emerged not from the cabinet but from the opposite side of the stage, where he must have slipped out through a concealed panel. He moved swiftly, illuminating the two figures in front of him with a bright lantern. One was indeed Mr. Hardback, and the other a henchman from the docks. Both wore expressions of utter shock. Holmes's voice rang out, authoritative as ever. "Thank you for taking the bait, Mr. Hardback. All evening, I suspected that you, not Elias Martin nor any other rival, were the true mastermind behind Frost's predicament. Your nervous manner and your insistence on controlling every aspect of this gave you away." Hardback sputtered, "You cannot mean, I was Frost's loyal stage manager," but his protest rang hollow. Holmes's eyes gleamed with cold insight. "You hope to seize Frost's smuggling connections and exploit them for yourself. You arranged for the Circle to believe Frost was betraying them, perhaps even fed them evidence to hasten his downfall. Then, once Frost was out of the way, you would step in as both the impresario and smuggler were inheriting everything he'd built." I stepped forward, revolver in hand, as the henchman tried to back away. "Stand still," I ordered sharply, "and keep those hands in sight." He froze, glancing between me and Holmes in panic. Hardwick's facade broke. "Yes," he snarled. "I had everything poised for a new empire. Frost was a fool to toy with the Circle, to believe he could steal that ancient relic. He was always an arrogant showman, and I was the one ensuring his illusions worked. When he turned traitor, I knew the Circle would come for him. All I had to do was help them find him, and when he vanished, I could claim his fame and fortune." Holmes lowered the lantern. "It was simple enough, wasn't it? Except you grew overconfident. Now Hardwick would tell us where he had hidden Frost." Before Hardwick could answer, a faint sound rumbled beneath the stage, wood scraping on wood. Holmes started toward the wings, beckoning me to follow. We descended a narrow flight of stairs into the theater's sublevel, where dusty corridors ran beneath the stage. At the end, we found a cramped compartment used for storage. Inside, bound and gagged, lay Maximilian Frost, pale, weakened but alive. Watson and I rushed to free him. He coughed painfully, meeting our eyes with desperate relief. "Holmes, Watson, you must hurry," he croaked. "Hardwick." He set up the stage rigged to collapse. "Of course he did," Holmes muttered, cutting the ropes with a penknife. We helped Frost to his feet and half lifted him toward the exit. Overhead, footsteps pounded. Hardwick and his accomplice were trying to flee or possibly trigger whatever trap they had. On set, we emerged onto the stage just in time for the local constables, whom Holmes had discreetly summoned beforehand, to apprehend Hardback and his associates. The rigging within the stage's structure rattled ominously, but the officers swiftly located and disarmed the sabotage. Thus, in a final chaotic tableau, the dreadful plot to topple the theater and everyone in it came to nothing. With Hardback under arrest, Frost slumped into a seat in the front row, exhaustion etched into his face. Holmes regarded the battered illusionist with stern eyes. "You tried to cheat the circle, endangering countless lives in the process. You must answer for your own crimes as well, Mr. Frost, but your life is spared for now." Frost nodded, too drained to argue, as the constables dragged Hardback away. I could not help thinking of the countless illusions that had filled this theater, mere shadows compared to the real deceit that nearly destroyed it. Holmes, sensing my thoughts, placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Watson," he said softly, "never forget, illusion and reality often overlap. This was a magician's drama indeed, yet the darkest stage is the one we cannot see until it's almost too late." And so ended the case of the illusionist's gambit. The circle was exposed, Frost's duplicity was laid bare, and the deadly spectacle averted. No applause greeted Holmes's concluding act, save for the relieved nods of the police. But as we left the Imperial Theatre behind, I felt an unspoken admiration for the great detective, whose feats of intellect had once again outshone any conjurer's trick. The end. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the story, please subscribe to the channel. Your unwavering support keeps me motivated.